Welcome to the Climate and Nature Summit. Really good to have you guys here because we're creating a space here for a meaningful conversation. And what we're asking today is, does the way we farm actually make sense? So we're going to be looking at land use around the world and in Ireland. We're going to discuss whether we can actually feed ourselves here in Ireland. We're going to connect the dots between climate breakdown, biodiversity, farming and feeding ourselves. And we're going to look at some of the root causes of the problems that we have in our farming system. Okay, so firstly, we're going to look at the world's surface. How much of the world's surface is covered in ocean? You've got 4 options there and you've got 5 seconds to talk to the person beside you to guess which one is correct. Excellent. Let's see if you got it right. So 70% of the world's surface is covered in ocean. So that means there's not much land surface in the world. So we've only got 30% of the world that is land. I want you to guess with the person beside you. Maybe you already know. What percentage of the land that we have can we actually live on? So out of all the land we have on the earth, what percentage of that can we actually live on? You've got 5 seconds. Wonder, did you get that correct? It is 71%. Okay, so we're going to focus in on this land that we can live on. What do we actually use it for? So we'll use it for towns and cities, agriculture and farming, and we'll use it for forests. So I want you to match these percentages to the land use. So you've got maybe 15 seconds to have a chat with your friend beside you. And for example, you might be thinking, oh, that 1%. Does that mean that we use 1% of the land that we can live on for farming? Or does that say that we're actually using 1% of the land that we can live on for forests? Or do we use 1% of the land that we can live on for cities and towns? So you've got 10 seconds to have a chat and come up with the answers. Halfway. Did you get them right? I wonder. So we use actually 46% of the land that we can live on for agriculture and farming. That's nearly half of all the land we can live on. We use 38% for forests and we use 1% for towns and cities. I wonder, were you surprised? Okay, so now we're going to hone in on this farmland. What do we actually use it for? So we use a certain percentage of the farmland to farm meat and dairy. So things like cattle and pigs and sheep and goats. We use a certain percentage of the farmland to farm crops for humans to eat. So I want you to consider what percentage of farmland is used to farm meat and dairy, and what percentage of farmland around, now this is around the whole world, all the farmland we use around the world, what percentage is used for growing crops for humans to eat. Now you've got about maybe 15 seconds. That's a long time to chat with the person beside you to guess those percentages. 5 seconds left. Okay, wonder did you get them correct? So we actually use 77% of farmland around the world to farm meat and dairy. And the rest, the 23%, we only use to grow crops for humans to eat. Is that a big surprise? Okay, so let's delve a little deeper into that. So over here, we've got some information on how much of the world's calories and protein meat and dairy produces. Over here, we've got some information on how much of the world's calories and proteins crops, fruit and vegetables give us. And then you've got these questions. So question 1, what produces more of the world's calories? Meat and dairy or plants? What produces or which produces more of the world's proteins, meat and dairy or plants? Does that make sense? So you have to explain your answer of why it makes sense or why it doesn't make sense to the person beside you. Are we using land efficiently? And based on that information, would you make any changes to our farming practices? And then you should be able to explain why you'd make any changes if you were going to make them. So you've got 2 minutes to have that chat, and keep an eye on the bar at the bottom, because at the end of it, we're going to move on. "30 seconds are gone. You've got just under a minute left. Now really think deeply, critically think about this. Does this make sense? Explain yourself. Would you make any changes? Getting close to the end. Okay, we're finished. So which produces more of the world's calories? Well, actually, bizarrely, we only use 23% of our farmland to grow crops. And that gives us 82% of the world's calories. So the small bit of land we use to grow crops gives us a lot of calories. Which produces more of the world's proteins? Again, the crops that we grow for human consumption gives us most of our protein, 63% of the world's protein. So the question was, does this make sense? And you had to explain your answer. So we use... what was it? 77% of the world's farmland to farm meat and dairy. 77%. And that only gives us 18% of the world's calories and 37% of the world's proteins. Okay, so we were discussing how land is used around the world. Now we're going to hone in on Ireland. So we're going to look at land use in Ireland. And you've got a map of Ireland and you've got also the keys here. So you've got water bodies, things like lakes and rivers, artificial surfaces like concrete and tarmac, semi-natural areas like parks and gardens, forests, wetlands like bogs, and agriculture. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what is the biggest use of land in Ireland? And can you put a percentage to that land use? So how much of the land in Ireland is used for that particular use? You've got 10 seconds and then we're going to discuss the answers. Okay, so the biggest use of land in Ireland is agriculture. And the percentage for that land use is 67.33%. So we use a lot of land in Ireland for agriculture. So we've just discussed how much land we use around the world for farming. And globally, it's about 50% of habitable land. In Ireland, it's much more at 67%. Now, we're going to ask the question, can Ireland feed itself with the food that we grow here? And to help us to do that is an organic vegetable farmer, Kenneth Keevy.
Yeah, we grow a lot of food, but we grow essentially two types of food. And one is, meat or beef in particular, one is dairy. And so I guess if you take the amount of exports we have, and if people are only eating meat and dairy, we may be able to do that. But when you look at whether we can actually feed ourselves in the context of all the different types of food we need, then clearly we're lacking somewhat in that particular discussion, and was it always like this? I guess that from the perspective of the vegetable industry in Ireland, it's been an industry that's been shrinking year on year, and there's various different reasons for that. It wasn't always like that, of course, and could we feed ourselves even here in Ireland? Never mind 35 million other Irish people drifting around the world. And I think the answer to that question, could we feed ourselves, is yes. Do we currently feed ourselves with the food we grow in this country? The answer is no. But most Irish people are only one single generation removed from actually growing their own food, maybe two in some cases. So our grandfathers' times, everybody at one time or another had vegetables grown in their own backyard. Our parents grew it, our grandparents grew it, and to an extent were semi-self-sufficient or at least had an experience of producing our own food. And that was really important.
How much of our veg do we import?
So, we import an awful lot of our fruit and veg, which is a shame. I think the figure is hovering up or in or around the 85% mark, which is massive considering the good land we have in Ireland, the mild climate that we have, the skill set we have, and the fact that we've got the ground, we've got the water, we've got all sorts of resources there, and we have every chance to be able to grow so much more than 15% of what we require. But for that to happen, of course, there has to be a change in the farming practices in this country.
What does food security mean, and what does that look like for Ireland? Are we food secure?
Excuse me. Well, I think it's becoming so much more important, Patrick, and even this year. And every year now, we have a different story about food not being available on supermarket shelves. And why is that? Well, excuse me. We're dependent on imports for our food. It's plain and simple. And if we want to be food secure, we have to grow the food closer to where we're consuming the food, right? So if we're getting our food from Spain, and there's a climate shock in Spain, as there was this year with unusually, unseasonably cold weather, then there's no food flowing into the supermarket shelves, and all of a sudden there's absences. If we grow the food here, we have the food here, and the benefits to that are amazing. You have better tasting food, you have fresher food, it's higher nutrition, it's seasonal, it's got less impact on the climate, it's lower food miles. In every aspect, it's the right thing to do.
Let's see what you've learned. You've got 5 statements here, and you have to decide whether they're true or false. For statement 2, look at the map of Ireland. Dublin is in red, and that will give you an idea about size. And these are all to do with farming in Ireland. So you've got 1 minute. Start the discussion now. You're at the halfway mark. Five seconds. Okay, we're done. Okay, let's see how you get on. So the first statement was nearly 60% of land area is used to grow grass. That was in fact true. All of the land used to grow fruit and vegetables would fit into an area the size of Dublin. That's actually false. It would be smaller than the size of Dublin. Ireland imports about 50% of all the fruit and vegetables we eat. Kenneth mentioned this in the video. It's actually over 80%. In 2022, we imported 75,000 tons of potatoes. Now, we're famous for growing potatoes. And actually, that is true. We had to import them. Ireland exports about 50% of the beef and dairy produces. That's actually false. We export the majority of beef and dairy that we produce. Okay, throughout this session, we're asking ourselves, does this make sense? This is the information we've been given. You've got 30 seconds to have a chat with your friend beside you. What do you think so far? Does it make sense? Okay, we're done. So we've discussed land use, whether we can feed ourselves in Ireland or not. We can't, we're not food secure. And to help us to connect the dots between farming, climate breakdown, biodiversity, and feeding ourselves, we're going to speak to Dara Wynne, who works for Goal.
Hi, my name is Dara Wynne and I work for the humanitarian aid organization Goal. So Goal works in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, and a lot of the work that we do is related to food. So ensuring that people have access to nutritious, healthy food, helping people to grow their own food and earn a living from that. And increasingly, we are working to make sure that communities can continue to access and grow food as the climate changes. Here in Ireland, we do a lot of work on education in schools with the children and young adults about global justice issues. So I'm here today to talk about farming and food and how it's connected to climate breakdown and biodiversity loss. And there are a few ways these issues are connected. So first of all, we need a stable climate to grow food. So if it's too hot, too wet, too dry, too windy, or too cold, food production will be impacted. And as we see more and more extreme weather, food supply is being increasingly affected around the world. And this year we've seen floods, droughts, fires all affect different crops in different parts of the world. But farming and food systems also contribute to climate change and biodiversity loss. So actually food production has huge impacts on biodiversity or nature, in other words. So 70% of the biodiversity or nature that we're losing on land can be linked to farming. And the simple reason for this is just that farms take up a lot of space. So globally, the biggest driver of deforestation is clearing land for farming. And then more recently, we're seeing intensive farming practices and the use of pesticides reducing biodiversity on farms. So even in the past, there would have been a lot more nature, wild animals, wild plants on farms than we have today. And to give you an idea of the scale of farming around the world, if you imagine all the land in the world and take away all the glaciers and deserts, what we call uninhabitable land, half of what is left is used for farming. So that just means there isn't enough space for nature. And when we look at what is happening on farms, over 3/4 of farmed land around the world is used for livestock, for meat and dairy production. But this sector actually only provides around 20% of the world's calories, even though it's taking up 3/4 of the land. And then, as I said, climate change affects food production, but food production also affects climate change. So about 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions come from food production. So things like the use of artificial fertilizers contribute to emissions, and that's why farmers are now encouraged to use less fertilizer. The transport of food increases our emissions, and that's why one of the reasons people are encouraged to buy local instead of eating imported food. But one of the biggest sources of emissions in farming is methane emissions from livestock. Around the world, 30% of emissions on farms come directly from livestock. So climate change is going to make food production increasingly challenging going forward. And if we're going to have a world where everyone has enough to eat and still have space for nature, we need to change the way we produce and consume food.
Everything is connected. Dara has told us about some of these connections. So now use what you've learned to try and make the connections yourself. Now you can use the arrows on the board and the keywords on the arrows to jog your memory. It's not easy to make these connections. So try your best. You've got 1 minute to talk to the person beside you and make as many connections as you can. You've got 30 seconds left. So we learned that because of the way we use land in Ireland, we're not food secure. We farm a lot of meat and dairy, which we export, and we don't grow enough of our fruit and veg, and we import quite a lot of that. Dara mentioned that farming is the biggest cause of deforestation. And because of pesticide use and intensive farming practices, that has a knock-on negative impact on biodiversity. We're losing biodiversity because of the way we produce our food. He also mentioned that farming plays a big contribution to climate breakdown. 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the way we produce our food. Adding fertilizer to the soil doesn't help because it disrupts all the wonderful organisms that are in the soil that help us to trap carbon. And he mentioned that 30% of our methane emissions come from farming cattle. We also know that climate breakdown is a big cause of biodiversity loss, and without biodiversity, we can't grow our own food. And Dara said that we need a stable climate in order to grow our food, and extreme weather is making it difficult to do that. Okay, we're at the last part. So we're going to discuss the root cause of the problem. So why are we here? Why are we in a place where farming has a negative impact on biodiversity, a negative impact on climate, and we're not food secure? We've got two farmers to help us navigate this. So we've got John Kelly, a dairy farmer, and Kenna Keevy, the organic vegetable farmer.
We have to be more conscious of the way we farm. If you just farm for profit and to make money, then these things don't come into your thought at all. But we know that that's not a responsible way to farm. As a farmer, we're gonna have to make more space for nature. We're gonna have to have less of an impact on nature, on things like water quality and emissions and methane and nitrous oxide and all these things that are byproducts of modern agriculture. The government's definitely responsible for plotting a course for us, so giving us direction of where we need to go to. And there's a lot of responsibility with that, because a lot of businesses just can't change overnight or change the direction. So in agriculture, it takes me a long time to change things in the farm, you know. So when it comes to the big decisions and the direction we go, it's really crucial that we get that right. And that's where government needs to tick all the boxes, which is a very hard thing to do. You know, they need to make sure food is produced safely, affordably, and also that the environment is taken into account. We need to value biodiversity and nature, and a very effective way of that is to put a value on it. It seems a bit crude to think that, but if you put a value on something, it's much easier for people to shape their decisions towards that. So say if you say, John, I want you to create enough space for owls and otters and whatever you want around the river, then to pay me extra money to make space on my farm for those things. And you will find farmers, as a rule, they're really willing to make space for nature.
I was at a rural development meeting a couple of years back, and a senior manager got up and stated something, and he must have been very close to retirement, because he wouldn't have stated what he stated otherwise. And what he said was, what was so wrong with the mixed family farm that we're driven towards this intensification that's currently the craze in the country? And I think here's the conundrum, or the center point of this problem. I mean, farmers are doing what they're being encouraged to do, right? So incentivizing, intensification in an export-led industry is what people are being told, what the people on the ground are being told is the right way to go. There's the grant structures, there are the incentives, there's the advice from the advisors driving people in this direction. So you take the advice, right, and you go off and you do what you think is the right thing to do. So you have a centralized kind of system where, and of course, driven by profit and financial incentives. That's the key. So we have a government pressing farmers to go down this road, and the cost, of course, is we pay the cost in terms of damage to biodiversity, to the landscape, to our food security, to everything else. So, change is required. Change is definitely required.
Change is really difficult. We need to change the systems that we live in to secure a livable future. So that means moving in terms of energy from a system that's based on fossil fuels to a system that's based on renewable energy. We also need to move into a sustainable farming system that when we're producing our food, it doesn't have such an impact on biodiversity and climate. But that's really difficult for the farming community. And they need a huge amount of support to do that from the government with things like financial incentives. And this is what we call a just transition, where as we move to more sustainable practices, we're bringing all those people with us who are involved in that change and supporting them in that transition. So, to end this session, I want you guys to consider, if you were leading the country, what would you do? So have a think about that, and then perhaps end the session with the walk-in debate, which you'll find in the notes under this section. Take care, and thanks for joining us.